Welcome to Vertical City. I'm your host, Lennon Richardson. During each episode, I interview one of the world's top experts in architecture, urban design, engineering, or ecology so that we can better understand and develop solutions for sustainable living. Thank you for listening, and get ready to join us on another groundbreaking and uplifting episode. This is Lennon Richardson with the Vertical City podcast. I'm joined today by Daniel Safarik. Daniel is the Asian Headquarters Director of the Council on Tall Building and Urban Habitat, CTBUH, which is the world's foremost authority on tall buildings. In addition to his role as the CTBUH Asian Director, Daniel is also the editor of the CTBUH Journal and is heavily involved in marketing and media relations. He also maintains a personal blog titled Unfrozen, where he writes about architecture and urban design. Daniel holds a master's degree in architecture from the University of Oregon, which happens to be located in my home state. This interview takes place at Tongji University in Shanghai, which is known as one of, if not the top engineering school in China. It is especially noted for its architecture, urban planning, and civil engineering departments. Links to CTBUH, Daniel's bio, and projects can all be found in the notes below. Daniel, welcome. So China is currently undergoing rapid growth, and they're undergoing quite of a building frenzy. I've heard that approximately 1/3 of the world's tallest buildings are currently located in China. Is this a trend that you think will continue to grow? What do you see happening here in the next 5 to 10 years?
It's very difficult to predict anything past 5 years in this industry because that is about the cycle of time that it takes to develop, design, and construct a tall building. And actually, that's relatively fast. There are many cases where it takes closer to a decade. But judging from what we have seen, and notwithstanding arguments about China's current economic state and slowing growth, we have not seen any evidence that this trend of building tall, super tall, and even mega tall skyscrapers is slowing in China. It's been said that people are concerned about the economy overall here and the slowing of growth, and they're expecting to see that reflected in property, but it so far has not happened. I think it just has to do with the overall plan, if we're going to speak about long-term plans of the government to relocate something on the order of 250 million people from rural areas to urban areas. That more or less necessitates tall buildings of some kind.
Sure. And so far, how do you feel China's handling this growth? Are they doing a fair job considering the pressures, or what can they be doing better?
Well, the pressures are in some ways manufactured, and in some ways they are representative of global economic trends. So I think all cities are struggling with this to some degree. China's just the most intense and extreme laboratory for this. I think that there are some issues. Certainly if you go to historic Chinese cities, there is less and less history to observe in the built environment. There have been well-documented cases of destruction of traditional housing, which is dense but low rise, such as the Hutong of Beijing, to make way for fairly banal and unremarkable tower in the park type developments that, to Westernize, is something that we have only now begun to correct as a failed model. Of course, we do have to stand back a bit and observe that Chinese society is quite different from Western society. It is, first of all, one that's used to dense urbanity to begin with, even though now we are seeing this large rural to urban migration. It is one that doesn't have the same issues with living cheek by jowl as some Westerners do. So I don't know if it's as shocking to longtime residents of China as it would be, to a Westerner to observe this kind of change. But even so, there is a growing sense that perhaps we should begin to preserve what's good about these high density environments that we already have and manage the growth of tall building districts so that they're well integrated with those communities. I'm seeing emerging sensibility about that, not only as you go through neighborhoods and you see plaques on older buildings that say this is heritage architecture, this is to be preserved, but you also see some developments where tall buildings are better integrated with the existing topography of uses and structures.
So how do you think this cultural heritage would be better preserved? Is it more of a change in philosophy, or is it a change in technique?
It is, in some ways, the philosophy has always been the same, which is that this is a much more collectivist society than what you would expect to find in a Western country where, the individual is more celebrated, and individual ambition is held up as the greatest thing. Here I think top-down planning has been the way of the land for several generations. Yeah. I don't think anyone who's alive today remembers a time that was any different. What is different is the emphasis on, you have an authoritarian government which is nominally communist, but which has really changed its emphasis from, collective farms and collective industry and manufacturing to something that more resembles the consumer society of the West, still with a high degree of centralized control. So parts of that philosophy have really changed and parts of it have not. How that actually manifests itself in the built environment is quite interesting. It doesn't seem like I think people are simultaneously happy to, in the case of residential development, move into modern conveniences. A lot of people, if you go into some of the older neighborhoods in Shanghai, you will see people living in conditions that are, to a Westerner, quite shocking. And they're ordinary middle-class people, at least by Chinese standards, but they live in conditions that we would think of as being squalid. Mm-hmm. So the opportunity for them to move into modern conveniences, I think, is embraced and generally valued. People like things that are new. It's definitely a strong cultural tendency, at least with this current generation. And so undeniably, the tall buildings that are going up are new. So sure. At that level, people can appreciate them, and I think they do. But at another level, I do think there is this kind of sense of, regret and a desire to push the pause button a little bit and think more carefully about how these developments are created. The better ones are those that are well integrated with existing investments in infrastructure and in some way incorporate the characteristics of the local place where they're being developed. The ones that are not so good are the sort of cookie cutter developments that you see on the fringes of the cities, which are simply taking advantage of the fact that there is available land. Mm-hmm. Some of those are well connected to transit infrastructure. Others are extremely automobile centric and quite isolated from the urbanities that they're supposed to be a part of. You can go, if you take the high-speed train in either direction toward Hangzhou or toward Nanjing from Shanghai, for example, you will see mile after mile of almost identical-looking developments that seem to be rising out of a field mm-hmm. that was yesterday, a rice paddy or something else. Sure. I don't know how great of an environment those are to grow up in or to live in. Ostensibly, these, master planning occurs at such a scale here that, and I think I'm answering a question you're probably aiming to ask,
Yeah.
which is, what are the benefits and drawbacks of this centrally planned approach?
Absolutely.
The opportunity that's really good there is that because things do happen at such a large scale and more or less by fiat from above, there is an opportunity to create wholly realized communities from whole cloth. That is, plan mixed use, plan this is where the subway line's going to go, this is where the street and power is going to go, this is where the grid is. We'll have a residential quarter over here and a business quarter over here, and it will all be accessible, and there will be all these self-contained amenities. A lot of them don't seem to be executed to that plan. Something goes wrong in the execution where one part doesn't get developed until much later. So you have these kind of half-built developments that are not fully realized cities, but in fact, people build the thing that they think they can sell first.
Sure.
And then they sell it, and then people are living in these isolated tall building communities that don't have any services. So the execution is not always as good as the planning. The other problem, of course, with planning by fiat is that there's basically no citizen participation. So you get what you get.
Yeah.
Probably worth mentioning here is the way that land is apportioned. It's important to understanding why we are seeing such unabashed construction of tall buildings, and particularly in large clusters of 10, 12, 20 that all appear to be the same style, same size, same height. A developer has a model that they go off of, that they think they can sell. But it's also controlled by the way that land is granted. So there are no property taxes. So if communities want to make revenue that is involved with the built environment, they have to sell the land. They sell the government actually, well, I shouldn't say sell. The government ultimately owns all the land. They can lease to 999 years or in perpetuity or some kind of incredibly long period of time to a developer, and they get a one-time injection of cash from that sale or extremely long-term lease, shall we say. Okay. And the developer builds their project, and they can collect revenue on top of that. But then the opportunity after that kind of goes away to maximize services to that area. They don't continue to pay property taxes.
So it sounds like there might actually be two different forces at play here that might have different objectives, that being the central government and then the developers. I've heard you mention a couple times now profit being a major motivation, and obviously, but do you feel like some of these other considerations like cultural heritage and sustainability, are they being considered enough, or is that something that the central government could possibly have more sway in?
Well, that is one advantage of the central planning and the degree of authority that can be exercised. I think China is much less monolithic than outsiders are led to believe. Actually, although there are certain municipalities that are under the direct control of the central government, many are kind of left to their own devices, and local authorities is as important as local culture. And the way that mayors are appointed, for example, someone who does very well in, let's say, Shenyang in 4 years wants to show progress. The easiest way for that person to show progress is to show the skyline changing.
I see.
And to show all these buildings being constructed. And everyone kind of knows that that means an injection of revenue also by making the land developed. Then that person will hopefully get a promotion to become mayor of Harbin next, and do the same thing there and keep doing it. So what's happened recently with actually the power has become more consolidated under the current administration, and they're actually very concerned about this type of trend. They see it as an opportunity for corruption. So they've actually put the brakes on that type of behavior. And I think they've tried to exert more central control. That could be very good for preserving local cultural heritage in the sense that it prevents developers from just doing whatever is most profitable overnight.
Yeah.
And then you can't undo what's been done.
Sure.
In the negative sense, though, I suppose the more central it becomes, the less regionally sensitive. You would need to incorporate planning restrictions such that the local characteristics would be preserved, and they vary quite a lot from region to region in China. Yeah, that's definitely an issue, and I can think of a lot of good examples of cultural contextualism that has made its way into skyscrapers, but there are probably many more bad ones.
Okay. Can you share some of the good examples?
Sure. One of the buildings that, just speaking on the level of an individual building, and again, my experience is greatest in Shanghai. I have been to a few other cities in China and, of course, know of other examples, but I think both of these examples will come from Shanghai. In terms of an individual building, the Jinmao Tower is actually very respected by architects and by the citizens, and generally regarded as a successful tall building that is specifically Chinese. It's kind of a evolution of the pointed towers of New York of the 1920s.
Okay.
In some ways, it's reminiscent of the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building or classic sort of Art Deco skyscrapers. It was designed by an American firm, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, but it also takes as its inspiration, the pagodas and the stepped structures of traditional architecture, and it kind of fuses them together in a rather interesting combination. It also incorporates a lot of the shapes that are important in local culture. There's some circular shapes.
Mm-hmm.
It actually has an interior, which you can't tell from the outside. It has a very large atrium that goes from approximately the 53rd floor to the 84th floor.
Wow.
That is circular. And the circles are very important in local culture as well. Now, you can't see that from the outside, but it's quite an elaborate building, and it's been done sensitively, I think. Actually, some more recent buildings, maybe less so. The only issue with that building is where it's located in general, which is Pudong. Pudong is the new development area to the east side of the Huangpu River,
Mm-hmm.
which was essentially just low-rise warehouses prior to the early 1990s, when it began to be developed as a new financial area. There isn't a whole lot of built architecture to reference in that neighborhood. But if you go across the river to Puxi, which is west of the Huangpu River, there is a neighborhood called Xintiandi,
Okay.
which, if you walk through Xintiandi, it has all the things that we consider to be positive about, a mixed-use sort of urban environment. There's a good deal of older buildings. They're called shikumen, which is kind of actually a hybrid of Western and Chinese styles. But they're basically row houses and townhouse-type buildings, 3 and 4 stories. They're made of brick. There's street trees that are 100 years old plus. It's at a human scale. There's vitality. There's life. There's a great deal of gentrification that has occurred, and it varies from street to street. But it has that feeling of a living, thriving neighborhood. But it is actually punctuated by a number of tall buildings, which I won't say they fade into the background exactly, but there's a conscious effort made to accommodate the scale of the streets and graduate that upwards so that the presence of these tall buildings seems natural and complementary, as opposed to jarring and sudden and as if they've just been dropped from space.
Yeah.
That's very conscious, actually. Xintiandi is actually the work of a single developer, which was able to get control of all this land, some of which was, let's be honest, I'm sure they have demolished some historically appreciable architecture, but which had probably become rather run down.
I see.
But what they kept makes the impression of that neighborhood, it all seems very natural. It doesn't look like, well, here's something that a developer dreamed up and just imposed upon the landscape. Pudong, that is less so. Pudong is in some ways a skyscraper museum with very broad streets. And it allows you to take excellent photographs of these tall buildings from every angle because there are very few human-scaled obstructions to prevent you from doing so. So as a place to admire skyscrapers, it's excellent. As a place to walk around and kind of window shop, not so much. But you see the successful integration of skyscrapers in an existing older neighborhood in Xintiandi, which is actually, a project that's been underway since the mid-1990s.
Do you know which developer that is?
It's called Shui on Land Development. Okay. And they actually have a number of projects in other cities in China that have the Tiandi suffix attached to them. And I'm struggling to think of some of the other cities. I think Chongqing has one. I think Wuhan has one. There are a few others. But they try to, I think they're a particularly sensitive developer. Unusual. Not everybody sees that opportunity and puts in the effort to enhance an existing environment and make it seem less sterile. But actually, it's a good investment because now that's a hugely successful neighborhood where everyone wants to be. They put in a man-made lake, relatively small scale, but there's like a focal point now for that neighborhood. And it also modulates, the tall buildings that are on one side and the sort of traditional buildings are kind of on the other. So there's a transition that happens through a usable public space, which wasn't there before. So it's certainly possible. There are other examples of this. I think Hong Kong, manages those transitions pretty well, although Hong Kong is, by nature, had a pretty significant head start on being a vertical city.
Oh, sure.
Other cities in China, less so. Actually, if you look at Shanghai, it's actually less dense than New York City. Bigger.
Quite sprawling.
Though. Yeah. So there's still quite a bit of work to do in making contextually sensitive vertical development.
Okay, great. So I'm curious, in the Pudong district, they have the new Shanghai Tower.
Yes.
And I think this building is quite interesting to me personally because I think in some regards it's sort of another Spectre building, but at the same time it's also quite more sustainable than what we've seen in the past. And I'm just curious as to how do you feel about it as far as like its fit in the environment and its ability to create a more sustainable lifestyle.
Right. I think it has very strong potential. I think it is a building that showcases a really high level of ambition, which something that is very difficult to realize. I don't know that this building could exist in the West. There's a lot of investment made in it, both from the government and from private investors.
I think I heard $3 billion.
I think that's probably close to correct. Yeah, that's probably about right. So it's hugely ambitious. It's a very interesting manipulation of form, and the sky gardens are really a spectacular idea, which is where you have the double skin of the building wrapping around in a corkscrew fashion, and then you have slightly revolved guitar pick shaped floor plates that rotate a few degrees around a solid core that stays the same all the way from the bottom to the top. But it creates these giant spaces that are 14 stories, which bring some of the aspects of what we like about being on the ground, nature, trees, good-sized trees can grow in there, a sense of spaciousness in several dimensions. I mean, I think one of the strange conditions about tall buildings is you can stand in one and have a spectacular view that's commanding. But, if you're under a low ceiling and you only have view in one direction, it's not that different from being in an airplane.
Oh, yes.
And you have a sense of being of being contained. I think Shanghai Tower tries to push against that by incorporating these large sky gardens at various critical points in the building. It also pushes forward an idea of mixed use, which is interesting. Lots of tall buildings have multiple sets of elevators so that you can reach different levels, some quicker than others. So you have an express elevator that will go past, the first 50 floors, and then you'll have to transfer at floor number 50. These sky lobbies present an opportunity for people to run into each other like they do on the street, on the ground. If you make it a nice environment, the sky lobby is less of a utilitarian place where you're just rushing from one elevator to the other, but a place where you might actually want to stop and have coffee, have a meeting, recreate, use this as your lunch break. Maybe you don't have to go all the way down to the ground and go outside to get basic services. Now you're in an environment where you have that sense of openness to the environment that maybe you don't get from sitting in your office. So all of that is great from an environmental standpoint, not just sustainability in terms of energy performance, which the double skin facade is meant to encourage, but also from a social sustainability standpoint. I mean, it just makes it a nice place to be. I'm saying all this from the perspective of not having been in the Sky Garden yet. I have not actually observed it functioning, and the building is not actually, at the time of this interview, completely open yet. It's in the process of opening still. So I don't think we can judge buildings fully until they've been operational for some period of time.
Fair enough.
We don't really know how it will perform. It's going to depend on the how many people ultimately occupy it. If it's fully occupied, obviously it will be more efficient than if it's only minimally occupied.
Sure.
If they have to shut off sections of the building because no one's there, I'm not sure how that will affect the functioning of the continuous double skin that goes around. Because the idea is that you have air balance, you have hot air rising and cold air falling, but that's affected by the number of people who are in the building and the warmth of their bodies and the air that they're breathing and the carbon dioxide that they're producing and the plants. It's all a balance, right? So it's never really been attempted at this scale before. Other buildings have done it successfully, but they're much smaller. The Commerzbank in Frankfurt has sky gardens and has operable windows from the offices, but Frankfurt is a much more temperate environment, than Shanghai in the summer.
Are those sky gardens, are those outdoor?
They're indoors.
They are indoors as well.
They're indoors, but they have natural ventilation, operable windows to the outside, and then there's a second skin that accompanies the offices. So the offices can open their windows to the interior environment of the Sky Garden.
Oh, I'm referring to in Frankfurt.
It's also the case in Frankfurt.
Okay.
Well, I do not think there will be operable windows directly to the outside. I'm pretty certain this is the case from the Shanghai Tower to the outside, and for various reasons.
Sure.
The massive scale of the building and the change in pressure that you experience going from the bottom to the top, I think it'd be very hard to control ventilation. You have elevators that are plowing up and down through the building. That creates something called a piston effect. So it makes doors slam. It pulls air through. So if the building is completely naturally ventilated, I think you'd have a lot of problems with pressure balance, and you would have a hard time air conditioning it when it's necessary to air condition. However, the Sky Gardens themselves are one layer of air that does not have to be as aggressively modulated and conditioned as it would in a self-contained, office floor. And then you have another layer between. There's one layer of glass between the Sky Garden and the outside, where you have another opportunity to modulate temperature.
Okay.
So if it's, let's say, I mean, this is common in Shanghai, say it's 90 degrees and it's 90% humidity outside. You don't want to work in that.
Sure.
Inside the envelope of the double skin, it could be something like 85 degrees and 70% humidity, just by the nature of, you have a layer of glass where you have heat that tends to want to rise. Now, toward the top of that cavity, it will be quite a bit hotter, but there's no occupancy there.
Sure.
It's inside this layer of glass. And then if you ventilate at the top, then a flow begins such that the cold air drops into this is how it's supposed to work, by the way, not tested yet.
Sure.
The cold air drops into the sky garden. And so the sky garden is, yet again, somewhat more comfortable than the air that's trapped in that cavity. And then past the sky garden, you have another layer of glass where you have conditioned space, normal conditioned space where, it's sealed up, but you have the opportunity to open windows and let breezes in. I mean, the air balancing of it is very complicated, is what I'm getting at. I don't have full command of it.
Okay.
But I think that is the reason why you don't have open windows to the outside. And then what happens when you have, you have conditions that vary from the very top of the building to the bottom. It could be several degrees cooler at the top.
Yeah,
so
that's interesting.
You have intakes that, fan-powered intakes that take in the cold air from the top and distribute it downwards. Long story short is most of the time, tall buildings generate much more heat than they need to be aggressively air conditioned 24/7. The conventional tall building needs to be aggressively air conditioned. Shanghai Tower, the way it's designed, will moderate that requirement, thus making it more sustainable than a comparable tall building of its size, of which there are very few. So, you get to that level, but it's at such a scale, it remains to be seen, I think, whether it will be truly performative.
Yeah. Maybe we'll have to have a follow-up interview in a couple of years from now.
Yeah, I mean,
see how you feel.
and someone, could explain, I could find someone within the organization who could explain better than I just did how that system is supposed to work. But I'm trying to describe what I think are the issues with it, as well as the benefits.
Sure.
In a general way.
So the Shanghai Tower and some of these other mixed-use buildings, I've heard referred to as vertical cities,
right,
which is different than the definition that we tend to use within my organization, simply because even though they are mixed use, they don't include everything that you would see in a city. Right. Do you think that if as we continue to develop new urban forms and we take these types of models like the Shanghai Tower, but possibly expand them so that there's multiple buildings connected together, is it something that we really could see a true vertical city?
I think we could, and I think the vertical city is a pretty loose term that's been thrown around for, pretty much as long as there have been skyscrapers. People have talked about city within a city and interpreted that at different levels. I don't know that it's necessarily wise to say, well, this is the definition of vertical city, and everything else has fallen short of it so far. We haven't achieved it yet, but it certainly could be far more developed. I think what most developers and designers call a vertical city now is basically a skyscraper with mixed uses located at different levels, and it's partitioned somewhat, and it's possible for you to travel within that building and obtain a number of services and or maintain a residence.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have, a lot of these buildings lack that element of serendipity and horizontality that we like about the urban street, where it's, I wonder what's around that corner.
Yeah.
I've never been to that next block. I wonder what's over there. And then you that feeling of discovery.
Sure.
By their nature, tall buildings are very highly engineered. They're very controlled in your experience of them. You can't just stick your head out the window. You can't just look around a corner in many cases. But those few buildings where you've seen within one development, you have seen horizontal connections at various heights. I mean, Singapore has some of the better examples of this. And actually, there's public space at the top of a couple of critical projects in Singapore, which has made a very deliberate effort to, probably the most advanced effort to bring that horizontal aspect of cultural life to the rooftops of buildings. We haven't seen too many examples of competing developers connecting their buildings together, which I think is the next step. There's a little bit of that in Hong Kong, where you have a skyway system that is a privately managed public space, but it's really only at the +1 level. It's one level above the street. It's a mode of convenience to get people across busy streets and or to not have to deal with the sometimes very difficult weather. It's a boon for developers who have now made those skywalks kind of an asset of their buildings, and they've maintained branding throughout those skywalks, and it's now as desirable to have retail on the second floor, or first floor in British terminology, the floor above street level, as the ground floor. I think it's reasonable to suspect that at some point the 50th floor will be the same, assuming that we can resolve issues of getting people up there and getting them across in an efficient way, and agreeing who owns these spaces, how are they maintained, how can they be used. I think that plus issues of fire exiting kind of has people a little nervous, and has prevented them from connecting buildings at height in that way, which isn't to say that it won't happen.
It seems that, though, if you had multiple buildings connected and there was some sort of fire issue, that it would be easier to exit, because you'd have multiple means. Multiple means
of egress, as they would say. Yes, actually, that was actually something that the PhD dissertation that our executive director wrote addressed that issue specifically.
I see.
Looking at sky bridges as a means of alternate egress in case of fire. I think that could be developed. I think it's more just the sense that the developers don't yet see the demand to bring that retail and bring the community services up to the 50th or 100th floor, where you can command the most, you're charging the highest rent. They haven't come up with a model that they think will draw people up there with the level of intensity that would be justifying those rents. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So I think it's more that than it is. I think the fire exiting issue is actually kind of a canard. I think it's a red herring.
Okay.
I think it can be resolved. You just need to have a protocol in place for when does this door close? When is this door open? How do you equalize pressure? I mean, all those things can be dealt with. I think the commercial will has to be there first.
Mm-hmm. You're in sort of a unique position at this intersection between architecture and communication. And we've talked a bit about these new possibilities for urban forms, and specific to China, but also just throughout the world. What sort of messaging do you think needs to take place in order to convince the powers that be that it's important to explore these other types of urban forms where we have different levels that people can live upon? So you can have these horizontal environments on the 50th floor, for example.
Right. I think that I think China is a good laboratory for this, because not only because of the intense program of moving people into urban areas at an unprecedented rate, but also because of the level of influence that the government can exert if it so chooses. I think what people need to be convinced of is that there is a shared responsibility for infrastructure that extends beyond the ground floor of a building. The way that a lot of civil engineering is done and a lot of code is written is that the responsibility of the public realm or the utilities or public services stops at the foundation of the building that is being supplied. And then from that point up, everything belongs to the owner of that building, and it's their problem to solve. Of course, there are safety codes that have to be met, but there's not this sense of the city is in layers and it goes up and up. I think that is the sort of the turning point where you'll be able to start advocating if there is a shared understanding that the public realm continues all the way to the top of the building and it's interspersed with private space. And the responsibility extends throughout the height of the building or buildings. That is what needs to be, that's what people need to be convinced of. How does that work exactly? Well, I think that there's a responsibility of the developers of the vertical developments to show how they can contribute to the overall urban mesh, if you will, by doing things like doing rainwater collection and doing things that benefit life on the ground with their tall buildings, so that there's a sense of collective ownership in looking up to these buildings. They're not just, icons of someone's ego or the symbolism that's intended by raising above the plane of the earth, but instead you have a sense that your community extends up into that building. And I think the strong communal culture of China and to some degree Asia in general is a great place to start that experiment. And it already does exist in some increments. I mean, again, Hong Kong is a really good example. Because of its topography and because of the proximity in which people live to their places of work and services and life, it's already pretty integrated. You've got this sort of escalators that go up the side of mountains and arrive on the 20th floor of a skyscraper. That already exists in Hong Kong to some degree. It will be more difficult in a flat city that has the ability to sprawl outwards with expensive infrastructure, for miles and miles. That the better way would be to build upwards and to integrate horizontally between those vertical elements. I think there has to be some cost-benefit ratio that's proven. We build water towers to maintain water pressure, right? Mm-hmm. That's how water comes up out of the sink, regardless of whether we live in, Oklahoma or we live in Hong Kong. That's how it works. If more tall buildings could participate in maintaining water pressure for the entire community and involve that somehow in using their height with collecting rainwater, with taking advantage of the fact that there are different temperature and humidity conditions at the top than at the bottom, that again increases the sense of, collective ownership. And if it can be proven that concentration of infrastructure in the horizontal plane, that is increasing the density of population and of infrastructure, is better than sprawling out into the landscape, then the public realm and the providers of public utilities will see the benefit and start to want to integrate the generation and collection of power and resources, food, water, electricity, into those tall buildings. So that the loop is, if you can imagine the loop as not only being closed, but stretched upwards like a rubber band, you then have complete systems and true vertical cities like what you're talking about.
Sure.
But we're not there yet. I mean, like, Shanghai Tower is going to be a really fascinating skyscraper, and it points toward the future, but it will still be a net energy consumer. Mm-hmm. It will still be a tremendous energy consumer. It will be much better than it could have been if it were built conventionally, but it's still pretty far from the kind of vertical city that we're talking about here, where there is a closed loop of infrastructure and services consumption and production that happens vertically as well as horizontally. I think that the authorities need to be shown just how efficient that actually is. And it's through demonstration projects like the Shanghai Tower, which points in that direction, that I think we'll start to see it.
So do you think that this is a message that needs to be directed towards the government officials or more towards the developers? Like who would be the one to pull the plug or pull the switch on this?
I have a hard time picturing this happening without some kind of government intervention, no matter what country you're talking about, because the government sets the rules about what type of buildings can be constructed. If they start to advocate for energy efficiency, for income equity, for access to services that is more equal and on a better level of distribution, then they can start setting zoning rules such that the skyscrapers have to conform to that. They will, of course, in order to not meet a huge amount of resistance from developers who've been used to doing the same thing over and over again, they will need to convince them that this is better for everyone because of the way that efficiency is better for everyone. It's just getting over that hurdle of not doing what you've been doing all along and doing something that's unorthodox is very difficult for someone who's been making a profit doing things the other way for X number of years. So I definitely think government will have a strong hand in it, but it's a dual effort. I mean, I think an organization like ours has a role to play in getting the authorities to talk to the developers and the designers to talk to both the authorities and the developers at the same time and make them mutually cognizant of the need to exploit and to capitalize on this trend toward urban densification that is already happening due mostly to natural forces, somewhat by fiat, depending on what country you're talking about. Yeah, I think they just need to be convinced of the efficiency and how will this actually work. There are many obstacles to still be overcome.
Sure. All right, excellent. Did you have any just thoughts in general or remarks that you would like to make?
Well, I definitely think that the vertical city concept is going in the right direction. The flaws of skyscrapers are pretty well documented. They can be very isolative, both for the occupants and for people who are observing them from the outside. Oftentimes, they are only considered in terms of their place on the skyline rather than at the level of human scale. I think that has to change if they're going to be considered an appropriate typology going forward. As resources become more and more scarce, we will be looking for more efficient ways to live. And the tall building definitely has a critical role to play in that. And I think that's what CTBUH and similar organizations are advocating. But it will require some creativity of thinking and some upending of predominant trends that have been going on for several generations. Dispersal, the gradual, suburbanization of the landscape. We're starting to see that retrench. I think, in North America and in Europe, people are becoming more interested in their center cities once again. In Asia, it's the suburban area has been rather short, but very dramatically expansive. Hopefully, we will start to see that draw again toward the center. But it's going to have to come with better ideas than just let's replicate the same 50-story building 80 times, and that will be fine. Everyone will live in an identical city that looks like a moon colony. I don't think that's what anybody really wants.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't inspire creativity.
No, and at the same time, I think it's okay if not every skyscraper is an icon. That devalues the individual character of a city if every skyscraper is some kind of gewgaw that is meant to be looked at and has no relationship with what's happening on the ground with the cultural values of the place where it's being built. That is also something that needs to be advocated. And again, it probably will come from the people's representative from government, because it is developers want to do whatever is profitable. Some are forward thinking and see the advantage in stepping back a bit and looking at the cultural characteristics of where they are and capitalizing on those to actually overall improve the environment. It's probably not the majority. So in order to get the majority to become a little bit more enlightened, organizations like ours have to work hand in hand with government and with people designing these buildings to improve the overall effect.
Okay, excellent. So the CTBUH, are there any specific projects that the organization is working on as a whole or here in Asia that you're particularly excited about that you would like to share?
Sure. Well, I would say that the most effective on-the-ground effect that we can have, is through our working groups and our committees. So a working group is defined within CTBUH as a group of professionals who come together to create a specific, I'll call it an educational outcome or an educational product.
Okay.
Most of the time, it is a publication. It is a book.
Okay.
That can break into a couple different categories, like a technical guide that would be very specific toward achieving one aspect of success in a tall building, like maintaining green walls, for example, or natural ventilation in a skyscraper, both of which are fairly new concepts. We have working groups devoted to those subjects.
Oh.
We also have committees, which are basically standing groups that produce multiple outcomes, and they're always convened. That is, they're never dissolved.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of standing committees. The most important one that I think speaks to the issues that we've been talking about here today is the Urban Habitat and Urban Design Committee, which looks specifically at the urban spaces around tall buildings. How exactly are these buildings integrated at the human scale with their surrounding environment? Do they actually enhance the environment of which they are part? How do we generalize about how to do that? They've actually said about, they will be creating a book called something on the order of Urban Spaces Around Tall Buildings. We haven't quite nailed the title down yet, which will address that issue specifically using case studies across the world. And it might sound a little bit casual, but I think a big part of that, the role of that group, is something that we just completed here in Shanghai and in 13 other cities around the world just last week, which was a Summer Spaces walking tour. So twice a year now, that organization will have an open to the public walking tour of what we think are exemplary, well-designed spaces around tall buildings that are well integrated with the existing cultural characteristics of the cities in which they reside. That example that I just gave of Xinjiang, that was the focus of our Summer Spaces walking tour with CTBUH. So similar, environments are being explored in everywhere from Auckland to Toronto to London. So I think if that outreach and education becomes a bigger and bigger part of what we do, that goes for China and Asia as much as it does for the rest of the world. Gradually the tide of public opinion will start to percolate into developments that match market tastes and into government policies that match the desires of the people to live, healthy, sustainable, fulfilling lives.
Great. Thank you. This has been a really excellent interview.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Vertical City. Learn more about the Vertical City concept and continue the conversation by visiting our website, verticalcity.org. I truly hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe to our podcast, leave a review on iTunes, and most importantly, share Vertical City with your friends and colleagues so that together we can create solutions for sustainable living. I'm Lennon Richardson, signing off for the Vertical City team. See you next time.